Florida's harshest prison, no escape from death row. The red light above the steel door began to flash. Inside Florida State Prison's death row wing, alarms ripped through the silence. A correctional officer had just shouted the one word every guard fears inside a capital punishment unit. Code. Boots pounded against concrete. Keys rattled. Radios cracked with urgent voices. In a narrow cell no bigger than a parking space, an inmate was lying motionless on the floor. The food slot hung open. Something was wrong. This was the death row unit at Florida State Prison in Rayford, Florida, the same facility where executions are carried out for the state. Every man here was sentenced to die. Every movement was monitored. Every door was controlled from behind thick reinforced glass. And yet somehow control was slipping. The inmate on the floor was Thomas Provenzano, one of Florida's most infamous death row prisoners. Convicted in 1984 for killing 2 bailiffs inside a courthouse, he had been locked in isolation for years. His execution date had been set before and delayed. Appeals came and went. Time passed differently here. The guard outside his cell shouted again. No response. Officers rushed in wearing protective vests. The cell door groaned open. The air inside felt heavy. Provenzano had attempted to harm himself using materials he wasn't supposed to have. In a unit designed to prevent every possible threat, even this one, the system had been tested. As medical staff pushed past security, one question hung in the air. How did a man in the most controlled environment in Florida manage to reach this point? Because death row is built to prevent chaos. Inmates are locked down 23 hours a day. Meals are slid through slots. Recreation happens alone in small cages. Cameras track every movement. Mental health checks are routine. Yet isolation has its own quiet danger, one that does not clang like a steel door, but grows slowly in silence. That night, the unit went into full lockdown. No movement, no showers, no recreation, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of boots on concrete. Provenzano survived the immediate crisis. But what happened inside that cell forced administrators to confront a deeper problem, not just about one inmate, but about what decades in isolation can do to a human mind waiting for execution. And as the prison tightened its grip, something else began to unravel. Because this was not the first warning sign.
And it would not be the last.
Long before the alarms echoed through the death row wing, Thomas Provenzano had already been unraveling. In 1984, he walked into the Orange County Courthouse in Orlando armed with a shotgun. Within moments, 2 court bailiffs were dead. The attack shocked Florida. Provenzano was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. The court ruled his actions were deliberate and calculated. Appeals followed, but the sentence remained. He was transferred to Florida State Prison in Rayford, the facility that houses the state's execution chamber. The transport process was silent and clinical. Shackles at the wrists. Shackles at the ankles. Waist chains secured. Armed officers on both sides. A one-way trip into a world built for finality. Death row at Florida State Prison is not like general population. There are no open dorms. No group recreation. No shared meals. Each inmate lives inside a single concrete cell with solid steel doors. The lights rarely dim. Conversations travel only through vents and cracks beneath doors. For 23 hours a day, Provenzano sat alone. At first, reports show he followed routine. He read legal documents, filed appeals, requested religious materials. But over time, his behavior shifted. Mental health evaluations documented paranoia and extreme beliefs. He spoke about conspiracies. He insisted he was being targeted. He filed motions claiming he was incompetent to be executed. Florida courts ordered psychological examinations. Some doctors argued he understood his punishment. Others questioned his mental stability. Years passed in legal battles over whether he was mentally fit for execution. Inside the unit, guards noticed changes long before court decisions were finalized. Provenzano would pace his cell for hours, muttering to himself. He covered vents with paper. He refused meals. On some days he shouted through the night, accusing unseen forces of plotting against him. On other days, he was silent, eerily calm. Death row officers are trained to observe everything. They document mood shifts. They log meal refusals. They report self-harm risks. But death row is designed for containment, not healing. The isolation tightened around him like a vice. Every few years, an execution date would be scheduled, then stayed, then rescheduled. Each time, the countdown began again. Final appeals, final motions, final visits, then delay. That psychological cycle, hope, dread, postponement, repeated over and over. By the early 2000s, tension inside the unit was rising. Guards whispered about his instability. Mental health staff increased checks. Administrators debated competency hearings. Then came the night the red light flashed. The suicide attempt wasn't just a personal crisis. It forced the prison to confront a question that echoed beyond one cell. What happens when a system built to carry out death must first decide whether the inmate's mind can survive the weight? And as officials prepared for yet another court review, Provenzano's behavior took a darker, more unpredictable turn, one that would place the entire death row unit on edge. By the mid-2000s, Florida officials were no longer just managing a death row inmate. They were managing a legal and psychological crisis that had stretched on for more than 2 decades. Thomas Provenzano's execution had been scheduled, halted, and rescheduled multiple times. Each date brought a surge of activity inside Florida State Prison. Extra staff. Emergency response teams on standby. Final meal procedures reviewed. The execution chamber, located just steps away from the death row wing, prepared. But one question kept stopping the process. Was he mentally competent to be executed? Under U.S. law, an inmate must understand the reason for their execution. Courts ordered repeated mental health evaluations. Psychologists interviewed him inside the same small cell where he had spent years alone. Some concluded he understood he was sentenced for killing 2 bailiffs. Others documented delusions and paranoid beliefs that clouded his grasp of reality. Inside the prison, the strain was visible. Guards reported erratic behavior. At times, Provenzano would refuse to come to the door for routine checks. On other days, he spoke calmly about religious redemption. The unpredictability made officers uneasy. Death row is controlled by routine. When routine breaks, tension rises fast. In 2008, after extensive court reviews, Florida's governor signed another death warrant. The date was set for June 11th. The countdown began again. This time, the courts ruled that despite documented mental illness, Provenzano met the legal standard for execution. He knew who he was. He knew why he was there. And he knew what the state intended to do. In the days leading up to the execution, security tightened. Cell searches became more frequent. Suicide watch protocols intensified to prevent another crisis. Mental health staff monitored him closely. Officers who had worked the unit for years felt the weight of finality. On execution day, Provenzano was escorted from his cell in restraints, flanked by correctional officers trained for this exact procedure. The walk to the execution chamber was short, but heavy with history. Florida State Prison had carried out dozens of executions before. The system moved with practiced precision. At 6 p.m., lethal injection procedures began. There was no riot, no last-minute appeal, no alarm. After more than 20 years on death row, years marked by isolation, legal battles, and psychological decline, Thomas Provenzano was pronounced dead. When the chamber doors closed and the witnesses departed, the death row wing returned to silence. Metal doors locked. Lights hummed. Officers resumed their posts. But the questions lingered. Florida State Prison had done what the sentence required. Yet the case forced administrators, courts, and the public to confront something deeper: how decades of extreme isolation intersect with mental illness, and whether the wait for execution becomes its own form of punishment. Inside those concrete walls, the system had proven there was no escape from death row. But it also revealed the hidden cost of keeping a man there for 24 years alone.